So our next panel is Transforming Police Practices. And our moderator, who's making his way up here, is our dear friend, Bo King. Bo is, Bo is a staff attorney in the Capital Habeas Unit of the Federal Defender Program here in Atlanta. He represents people facing the death penalty in post-conviction litigation. Bo has really dedicated his career to fighting for social justice as a public interest lawyer. In addition to his work at the Federal Defender Office, he's been at Alabama's Equal Justice Initiative and the Atlanta Legal Aid Society. He's also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Uzbekistan, and he's a leader within the Georgia chapter of the American Constitution Society. We love and admire Bo so much because he will do anything to not only fight for his clients, but for all people facing injustices. And we're so happy to have him moderating today. Ready, go.
Well, on the theory that it is the least adequate credentials that require the most burnishing, I'm going to give much briefer introductions to our very distinguished panelists. But Sarah, I've rarely been more embarrassed, and you've met me. I'm embarrassed often. We are incredibly fortunate to have an assemblage with this much acumen and lived experience in the topic that we're addressing. I'm going to start off by introducing us to Robin Shipp. Robin has served as a state representative in the Georgia General Assembly, as the immediate past Democratic nominee for Labor Commissioner, as a college professor, as Associate General Counsel for the Grady Health System, but first and foremost, and for 20 years, she's been a criminal defense lawyer. And from those experiences, she and her co-author, Nick Childs, have written this book, Justice While Black, Helping the African American Family Navigate and Survive the Criminal Justice System. This book will serve as a jumping off point for our discussion. Next, we have Jerry Weber, and I'm going by order in which everyone is going to be speaking. Jerry is a senior staff counsel with the Southern Center for Human Rights, while maintaining simultaneously a private constitutional law practice. He's an adjunct professor of constitutional litigation at the Emory and Georgia State Schools of Law. For 17 years, he was the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia. He is widely recognized as one of the preeminent defenders of civil liberties, not only in Georgia, but across the country. And we have Mally Davis, who is co-founder and partner at the Davis Bozeman Law Firm, where he leads both its civil rights and criminal defense practices. His notable victories include winning a civil verdict against an NFL player, obtaining not guilty verdicts in many murder trials. As you'll see in his materials, Mally has been dubbed both an activist attorney and a liberation lawyer in recognition of his tireless and innovative combination of courtroom advocacy and community organizing and activism. He is currently the 31st president of the DeKalb Lawyers Association. And given that we have a compressed time schedule and wonderful things to talk about, I'm going to start with Robin.
Sure.
Now, Robin, I've already waved around your book. Now, this book is both a critique of systemic bias in our justice system, but as the back of the book suggests, it's also a guidebook. Practical guidance on surviving the prison industrial complex. It seems very much in the tradition of Victor Hugo Green's Green Book, which was published during the Jim Crow era to help African-American motorists find safe passage while traveling in the United States. Both are books of pragmatic advice to help people navigate indefensible realities. But by prescribing what's required to navigate these injustices, you end up detailing them very precisely. So we've given Robin a very hard job. Could you open our discussion by taking the first stab at the evolution of the relationship between African Americans and law enforcement? Take that whatever direction you want. I ask that knowing we're basically asking you to summarize all of American history. But I think you're up for it.
Thanks, Bill. And thank you so much, Terica, for asking me to be a part of this, which I believe to be a vital conversation with regard to race, poverty, incarceration, and implicit bias in our criminal justice system, the history. We started out in this country, we being African Americans, in involuntary servitude. And the policing notion evolved from that relationship of African Americans as former slaves. And in fact, in the South, policing began as a way to control movement of African American populations. First, it was to identify where the slave was, and then after emancipation, it was to ensure that the newly freed slave was not taking retaliatory actions against large populations of predominantly wealthy white individuals, former slave owners. We have parlance that we utilize today that developed back in those days. Patrol. Patrol was and is the modern concept of patrolling a community. It's all the same thing. Back when our relationship began, when policing began to evolve into an entity, the patrol was for purposes of ensuring that slaves or later newly freed slaves or those who existed under the whip, so to speak, of the Jim Crow era, that these individuals were where they were supposed to be, particularly in the evenings. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, and I'm going to transition quickly to Jerry. Jerry, as I mentioned, you've done a lot of work in defense of civil liberties, particularly lately. You've litigated a number of cases concerning police interference with civil liberties, particularly concerning the right to videotape and photograph police. Now, as Robin's book discusses, many people fail to assert their civil rights in encounters with police and to keep their constitutional rights protected during their encounters with the justice system due to both not knowing that they have them or uncertainty of their scope. So what are some of the civil rights that everyone should understand and be prepared to assert during an encounter with police? This is compound, and I'll circle back, but also want to talk about how the legal doctrines and barriers to vindicating violations of those rights are changing.
Sure, and I've talked to a lot of student groups about this question, and the most important lesson I hope that I give them is you've got to survive the situation.
Right.
There are people who are reaching for wallets who are being shot. There are people who are walking away who are shot. There are people who are saying the wrong things who are shot. You have to survive that police encounter if the officer is confronting you. Fight it another day. And a lot of what I'd like to talk about later is the ways you can fight it, the empowering of the citizen. But you don't have to consent to a search. That's the first thing you don't have to do, and you probably won't get shot for that. And you have to cooperate at all times with the officer. When that encounter ends, and it can be a long encounter. I had a case where I represented in a racial profiling instance a college student up in North Georgia. His offense was a taillight. That's what the officer said. When he was pulled over, the officer started asking him why he had a white woman in his car. The officer decided that because of this taillight, he certainly needed to call out a drug dog because he had smelled something. The encounter lasted well over an hour. The drug dog was brought in, the questioning kept going and going. There were lots of opportunities where any reasonable person would have said, WTF, what is going on here? He did the right thing. He didn't say that. And so he survived the encounter, and we were able to fight it later. So I think that's the primary lesson. There are lots of rights that you have and lots of rights you can and should assert, but in that moment, you want to survive.
Melly, I'm going to go a little bit off script, but I saw you react to the concern about surviving the encounter. And I think we all winced sort of reflexively when Jerry said you will probably not get shot for refusing to be searched. But you have been very involved in recent months in protests of officer killings of men in Louisiana and in Minnesota. Last month, you led 24 hours of protest at the Fulton County Courthouse in anticipation of the grand jury's decision on whether to indict an Atlanta police officer in the death of Daravis Kane Rogers. And again, back in July, there were 4 nights, I think at least 4 nights of protests concerning police shootings of Alton Sterling and Philander Castile in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. Those have precipitated a lot of discussions of policing practices and focused attention on the concept of community policing. How do you think that those encounters and the conversations that have come out of them are informing some of the encounters that Jerry's discussing? Are we more or less likely after these things to be seeing folks shot for turning down, being searched?
I have to start, Bo, by saying the name of Terrence Crutcher, Kane Rogers, Jamarian Robinson. I think we have to begin every conversation repeating the names of those who have lost their lives in police encounters, both in this country as well as specifically in Atlanta. Sometimes it's easy for us to look outside of Atlanta and outside of Georgia and rise up about what's happening in Tulsa and what's happening in Baton Rouge, but not acknowledge what's happening right here with the Atlanta Police Department, with DeKalb Police Department, with Clayton County Police Department, with police departments throughout the state of Georgia. And so I have to start there to just give honor to those who have lost their lives at the hands of law enforcement. And unfortunately, if the record remains the same, it will be without any consequence. And so that is what is deeply troubling. It's not that they've lost their lives, but they've lost their lives and no one will ever be held accountable. With respect to the protests that we have been engaged in and working with young people with, I think that they have created a dialogue. I think we have said for some years now that in order for us to see some change, that the power structure has to be disrupted, flat out. That it has to not be able to continue to function the way it has been functioning without, with a no justice, no peace chant, and then we all go back inside. I think one of the things that Ferguson taught us was that the longer you can stay in the street, the longer you can disrupt commerce, the longer you can disrupt society's norms, the more likely it is that somebody will have to listen and have to do something to at least get you out of the street. And so the 24-hour protest was one of, again, attempting to both raise awareness and to create a dialogue around, here's an opportunity, here's an unarmed African-American man simply getting in his car and driving away and being shot in the back of the head. And there was literally about a half-day coverage in the Atlanta media about what happened to him. There was nothing. And we felt like it was important for us to elevate the name of Kane Rogers and this pending indictment. And the only way to do it, and we talk about this quite openly, that unfortunately we live in a system that is a white supremacist institution that just rolls, and it rolls 24 hours a day, and that we have to have the resolve to stay up for 24 hours to ensure that, as the young people say, we stay woke and we don't allow the system to beat us and to just grind over us. And so that's, the approach that was taken with that. And I think the more we keep young people in the street and we support them, the more likely is things will change. But as soon as we go in, it just goes back to normal. We have to be ever vigilant in this struggle.
Well, and pivoting off of that back to both Robin and Jerry. So Robin, again, a good part of your book is really a how-to guide for sort of accepting a circumstance as it is.
Yes.
Unjust and reprehensible beyond measure, but as Jerry said, to get to the other side of the encounter.
Right.
So one of the issues we see is that there is a lot now of public clamor for reforms. We're seeing increased protests for reforms. I think everyone is very happy to see this continue. How do you advise people who who are taking to the streets to protest a shooting, who are trying to advocate for reform, what is the advice that you give them concerning their rights and staying clear of the very system that they're objecting to while doing so?
Right. What I found, or the impotence for the book, was the fact that so many young people, I believe here in the state of Georgia in particular, are not aware of the existence of the Constitution, nor that it is this living, breathing document that really does have some genuine impact on their lives. I would often encounter young people in particular, but then there are some older folk also, who very quickly relinquished when faced with a police encounter, relinquish those rights which all of us here, all of those who are watching via the satellite link up, et cetera, remotely, all of us have a tendency to take very much for granted. We all know that when the police come to our vehicle and stop us, that we have to give them our driver's license, but that's about the extent of what we are obligated to give them. More so here in Georgia because our proof of insurance is in their system now. So we don't even have to drive, I don't drive around with a insurance card. But young people who I believe somewhat intentionally are not receiving the benefit of an education, say, that I received when I was in high school or middle school, and that is woefully inadequate with regard to civic lessons, caused, some would say, by funding shortages. They do not have that type of knowledge base. So when I have been privileged to represent young people, whether this is as a result of protest that they have voluntarily engaged in, fortunately these young people did receive their civic lesson and understand that the founding of this country was protest. So when I've been privileged to get a 2:00 in the morning call from Mally for attorneys to show up at the Atlanta City Jail and have been so inclined to roll out of bed and get down there, it's always a refreshing experience for me to see them rolling out of the city jail, and they're waving their arms in celebration with the fact that they're being released, albeit very temporary until we have to go and appear before a judge. But the legal team that is assembled in a protest situation, some of the finest attorneys that I've ever had the pleasure of working with, and they're very quick to say, what is public property, what you can walk on, what is private property, how you should, in being loud and bold and proud in your protest, how you should speak with, in your encounters with police officers, how you should articulate that protest such that you as an individual or collectively as a group don't further compound the original arrest with additional arrest during the course of subsequent protest. So that is something that's very carefully covered during the consultation with these young people. My book is really addressed to those young people who have never had those types of conversations, who don't go out and protest, who find themselves as they stand on a street corner encountering law enforcement every single day. Mm-hmm. Those young people who were just going to go and hang out at a friend's house and they all pile up in a car and they're pulled over, and the next thing they know, they're all on the ground. That's really what I designed this part of my journey to address. Those are the ones who are so often, as our previous panel talked about, they're poor, they're minority, they're black, they're brown. In the North, they are Muslim. Those who, and in the South, they are also white. Those who are often voiceless and disenfranchised from the mainstreams of our system. And it breaks my heart to hear, like the previous panel, the statistics. Those are real statistics. Those are real people who have suffered under a boot. We talked in the latter part of the 80s about, and I know I'm way off base, but I'll do this on occasion.
We asked you earlier to summarize all of American history, so I think you're well within your...
We talked and we marched and we fought, and in the latter part of the 80s against apartheid, the apartheid South Africa. But and many people said, how can you do this, United States, when you have a system of apartheid here in your country? How dare you come and question our country? And that apartheid has become so glaringly apparent in the need for Mali to say those names, in the need for these protests. And I believe that through this protest, we will ultimately, I hope it doesn't take 80 years, as Ashley indicated, but we will ultimately have that paradigm shift.
Well, certainly, Jerry, one thing that has shifted the paradigms perhaps permanently is that all of us now walk around with high-resolution cameras in our hands, which we can pull out at a moment's notice to document things that we have known been happening for, well, let's say the whole of American history and move forward. How has that changed? What are the rights that people need to understand about how they use this to document interactions with police? And then beyond that, there's the talk about body cameras. The notion basically, and I realize that isn't necessarily an easy fit of topics to discuss together, but this notion of what our rights are when encountering the police, to document that encounter, when observing police conduct, to document that, and then what effectiveness you see in requiring the officers also to record themselves.
Yeah, and I'm going to suggest it's partly a rights question, but it's partly an obligations question. I think every single one of us has an obligation to our fellow man and woman to, when we see a police encounter happening, to, from a distance where you're not interfering, break out your camera. It will matter oftentimes. I mean, think about Walter Scott. When Walter Scott was shot in North Charleston, the officer's tale was this. He said, well, it started with a tail light. That was the reason he pulled over Walter Scott. And then the officer said there was a struggle over a taser. They were at close range, and so he had to shoot 8 times, 5 times in the back. That was the officer's tale. That tale would have held up. That officer would still be on the force, but for a camera. And the camera showed that Mr. Scott was not struggling over a taser. He was 15 feet away, running away. He was never near the taser. He was shot 5 times in the back. And then the officer took the taser and moved it to Mr. Scott. That's the difference between officer still on the force and officer off the force and facing a murder charge. I now have had, and have right now, one with you, 7 cases involving the city of Atlanta arresting people because they broke out that camera phone. That is another piece of evidence that the camera matters, that it does change things. One of the cases that I talk about, because it was really the first one of these, was Felicia Anderson. She was sitting in her house in the West End, and she hears screaming outside. And she goes outside and she sees her neighbor being dragged down the sidewalk with blood behind him. She has no idea what's going on, but she broke out her camera. She filmed what was happening. She documented what the police were doing. Now, she got arrested. She got arrested for disorderly conduct, which is what they always charge them with. And strangely, this officer decided that even though she was walking on a sidewalk, that she needed an ID. She was not driving, but that was the other offense that she was charged with. We got the charges dismissed. She didn't fight the situation, kind of going back to my first point, at the moment, but did fight it later on. And out of that first lawsuit, and we've had many afterwards, but we have a policy now that the city of Atlanta has put in place as the result of that lawsuit that says that officers cannot interfere with citizens filming if they are filming from a safe distance. They cannot delete the images. They cannot take the camera. If they do so, they face dismissal, which requires that you then file a citizen complaint against the officer to really make that happen. So the camera matters, and the citizen camera kind of paints the whole scene. And there's a lot of talk about body cameras, and I think body cameras also matter, but in a different way, because they are filming what the officer saw. And the Department of Justice has allocated over $20 million to departments having body cams. And there have been some studies, and the studies show that body cams also have an effect. In San Diego, complaints against police went down 40% after body cameras were employed. Use of force complaints went down 46%. Use of pepper spray went down 30%. If there's someone watching, this being the camera, it changes things. It changes things dramatically. There was another study that showed that use of force complaints in that jurisdiction went down 87%. And so it really does ultimately matter. There are so many collateral benefits of having a camera. Citizen camera, most assuredly, because they wouldn't be arresting these 7 folks if it didn't matter, and body cameras. So going back to my original point, you have a camera, you have it in your pocket, you see arrests happening, you see police going up to some group of folks. Spend 5 minutes. It's probably going to take about 5 minutes. Take the camera out of your pocket and film it.
Mally, my understanding is that you prepared a brief presentation for
Very-
this panel, and I want to make sure that you have time to. I also wanted to give you the opportunity, since I know you and Jerry have worked on any of these cases together, to supplement what he said in any way you like.
No, I can't supplement that. This
Jerry's
is
good.
This
I
is his
mean-
life's work. I mean, he gets this better than I think any other attorney in our country, probably, but definitely in the state of Georgia. One of the things that we've talked about is, how do we get them to stop killing us? That's a real deep, crazy question, right? When Troy Robinson was tased to death, he was tased as he was running away, and he was on an elevated wall, and he fell over and broke his neck by DeKalb County Police over a year ago. We started this hashtag Stop Killing Us, and this hashtag Stop Killing Us is everywhere now because we don't know how, as a community, to get law enforcement to stop killing us. And this is the latest example of this brother, walking with his hands up and then somehow ending up shot in the back and laid out on the ground. And of course, the narrative from law enforcement is that it's justified because he wasn't obeying commands, absolutely unarmed, right? So we've been getting Facebooks and texts all day. This is deeply disturbing. I would hope it disturbs everyone in here, but you're trying to answer questions of your 16-year-old. That's hard. Like what are we supposed to do, right? And so there's an organization that somebody asked me to be a part of, this National Coalition to Combat Police Terrorism. And I said, okay, I'll be a part of it. And this was over a year ago, and I've kind of been, not really active with it. But today I decided I'm about to get real active with it because we're out of options. I'm a president of an NAACP chapter. I work with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, support Black Lives Matter, a lot of organizations, but this one I'm about to start focusing some more attention on, and I'll tell you a little bit why in a moment. Cynthia McKinney and Daruba bin Wahad are co-chairs of it, and there's a need for a shift. Jamarian Robinson, some of y'all probably are not familiar with, shot 76 times, right? 76, won't one bullet do? 76 times they shot his hands almost off of his body. The autopsy photos, which we now have, are absolutely disturbing. They took shots. We recovered bullets that were flat, like shot directly down, as if they shot directly into his body as he laid out. We live in this stuff, and it's really troubling. And so I must have skipped my slide. This must be, so let me just tell you, because I think it's a different slide. So what has the conversation been? The conversation has been, well, what about black on black crime? That's as soon as we raise up, somebody says, what about black on black crime? Then they say, tell them to stop running. Then they say, tell them to just stop committing crimes. Then they say, this is acceptable, this is unacceptable protest. But they haven't told me what protest will get it fixed for my 16 and 18-year-old so I don't have to worry about them when they go out at night. Tell me what protest to do, and I'll do that protest. But for the folk that are not at risk to try to prescribe a remedy as to what's acceptable protest when folks are getting killed in the street makes no sense. They've asked us to, so then what have we done? What have we tried to do? Now, I'm just really trying to lead up to why I am getting more involved in this organization. So we've had town hall meetings. We've had meetings with police from, top to bottom. We've met with every prosecutor from DeKalb, Fulton, Clayton, every one of them. We've asked for GBI involvement. For a long time, the GBI wouldn't even get involved. They were allowing, or the DeKalb, for example, they were investigating themselves. So they would have someone do the shooting, kill someone, and then they would bring in their officers and do the investigation, right? And we're supposed to think that that's a way towards justice. And so we have to protest and go off, and folks are like, well, why are you all going off? It's the only thing that the people are responding to, So we've done that. Then we ask for, we've met with the U.S. Attorney's Office probably, a dozen times. We go down there all the time and say, hey, can you help? Can we get the Department of Justice involved? We need some help on all of these different cases. And it's like, well, we can't show a pattern because it's happening in Atlanta, then it may happen in DeKalb, then it may happen in Clayton. So we can't, it's not like Ferguson where you can say one particular police department. And then this, let's call for body cameras. Eric Garner is killed on film, right, and no one's held accountable. Right. So it's just it's a very frustrating place that I'm in, both as an activist, as an attorney, but more than anything as a father, of two black boys. Is really alarming and painful. And so there's a shift that's needed. And so what the NCCPT is really calling to do is that we have to do something very radical and abolish policing the way it currently is structured completely. And I know folks are saying, well, that's not possible. What's not possible is for us to keep going at this rate and for us not to have more police just being gunned down randomly. That's where we're going here, because I'm a very cerebral, logical brother, and I'm frustrated. And so if I'm frustrated, there are young people who are like, you know what, later for this. So the idea of getting your highway blocked, if that's like deeply troubling for you, then help. Let's stop. And so we're talking about the need to decentralize the police department so that communities can control police in their community. Right now, we don't have any say-so with law enforcement. There is no community involvement in terms of what officers patrol. There is not a level of decentralization that needs to happen. And so these are radical ideas, but we think it's time for radical change. And so we're putting together different organizing efforts to try to raise awareness about this different approach of how do we really find what we need are modern day abolitionists to help us abolish law enforcement the way it's currently structured. So with that, those are my 2 cents, and we'll come back
Oh, that was,
whenever.
that was at least $2.22.
Let me just add this one point. Mally said that no one was prosecuted in the Eric Gardner murder case in New York. Actually, the person who was ultimately penalized was the African-American female supervisor who was the last person to arrive at the scene. She was busted down in rank. She lost her stripes, and at one point was facing some sort of criminal prosecution. So just to add that to that.
Not the one that choked them out.
Not the one that choked
Not
him.
the one that
Right,
killed him.
right.
Well, we want,
Right, and the person who filmed, he went
Right,
to jail.
and he's in prison also, federal prison, I believe. Yeah.
well, we made a seamless transition into audience participation. So this is actually, no, it's perfect. It's time for questions. So please, if you don't mind, we have a microphone, so if you can wait till the microphone gets to you to ask the question, we'll make sure everybody can hear you. And I believe, yes, hi.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Many police officers and their families fear that some changes being called for increase the risk that police officers take on. For instance, if they're hesitating longer, waiting to collect more information before they shoot, they put themselves more in harm's way. Are there other ideas that can be, other reforms that can be implemented that do not have this effect of increasing the risk to police officers, and that we could potentially join and find common ground with police officers in, like, for instance, more non-lethal options for officers, more body cameras? I don't know. But are there things that don't increase risk to the police officer?
Actually, the police officers' policies themselves require non-lethal force. They just have diverged drastically from the use of non-lethal force. I actually have some relatives who are police officers, and they're not concerned about any kind of changes to training or requirements and body cameras, and not turning off your body cameras when you approach someone that you view as a suspect for whatever. Those police officers and the experiences that we have seen in the last 4 years, we're not painting all police officers with the same brush. There are some really good police officers in this world. The ones who we hear about who have committed horrific offenses, made a conscious decision to shoot to kill someone rather than, and those instances happen to involve African American, for the most part, males. Those are the ones that we've seen on TV. So what we have to do fundamentally is decide that today I am not going to kill somebody because they are slow in giving me their driver's license. And that should not be uncomfortable for any police officer walking on the face of this earth. I just don't understand how we get from hand me your license and registration to why did you shoot me, which we heard on tape in a case in South Carolina, and in any way contemplate that that is good policing. So they need to adjust.
One thing is I think we should consider more a residential clause, so that if you're going to police a community, you have to live in that community. That might help. The other thing is we say the grand jury reform is a good example of how stuff works in this country. So a bunch of organizations have been calling for grand jury reform around dealing with law enforcement. And those organizations were a lot of civil rights, human rights organizations calling for this reform. And instead of being called to the table when the bill is shaped and constructed, it's all done behind closed doors with the district attorneys, the prosecutors, counsel, and the sheriff's association, with no input, zero, from any of the organizations that have been marching in the street and calling for grand jury reform. Zero. So when we look for common ground, it has to go both ways. There's an opportunity for them to engage all of these different organizations that represent constituents that are affected by the grand jury. And when I talk about grand jury reform, I'm talking about when police were allowed to remain throughout the entire grand jury presentation and then to have the final word without cross-examination and without any rebuttal. And so when they decide they're going to make a change, they don't sit down with any of us. And that's not me personally. But they don't sit down with anybody. They just go do it. Right. And so now we're, called to, how can we work with the police? How can they work with us? They had a chance. They didn't. And these are intentional, because it is this idea that we are above you and we're not a part of the community. That's part of the problem. Be a part of the community so that you know the folks in the community, so you know who's there. You're not just randomly taking beats and shooting folks.
Yeah, and I'd have to say that and there's always focus on training and reform. Sometimes it's just what the courts do. The Supreme Court in Wren, a case called Wren, W-H-R-E-N, said it was okay for police to engage in pretextual stops, to engage in racial profiling. If that decision had gone the other way, it was a 5-4 decision, a lot of the encounters that are dangerous to the citizens and the police officers would not be justified stops. They would never occur. There's a whole line of Supreme Court precedent that's been kind of bastardized around when officers can and cannot use deadly force. And it's been interpreted to the point that if somebody is reaching for their wallet, the officer might be justified. And so in training, they are told that. And when they draw their gun, bad things happen, maybe to them and maybe to the citizen. So the legal precedents have created a scenario where citizens are not as safe, and oftentimes officers are not as safe.
And one other point I want to make, it's important that we have and maintain an independent judiciary. and that judiciary is accountable to a watchdog organization like the Judicial Qualification Commission. And there is legislation that is floating and pending that would do away with the Judicial Qualifications Commission and the wonderful work that they do in ensuring that we have jurists on the bench who are accountable, who are following the law, not just the letter, but and also the spirit. So you need to make sure that you are active in lobbying your legislators and your citizen constituencies to ensure that we maintain an independent judiciary.
I think we might have time for maybe one more question, maybe two.
I'm sorry.
Thanks very much. I'm with you on all of this. For those of us who are full-time social justice activists who are working on these issues every day,
God bless you.
there's two issues that I have a problem with, and I heard one of you say something about the GBI. The experience that we're having is that having the GBI investigate police shootings as being a total waste of time. They give it short shrift, we've discovered, and again, it's policing the police. I'm interested in the response from you folks on, is a special prosecutor the answer to getting a fair and just result? And the second part is there any way at all to supplant the grand jury, I call it a star chamber, on these police shootings? Because again, it's getting us absolutely nowhere.
On the first issue of the GBI, I've been terribly disappointed with the GBI. I think, they're involved in the Jamarian Robinson investigation. They were the organization that left the two slugs behind. We had to hire a private investigator to find it. So I think the part of the push needs to be for an independent investigative body that is not, because the GBI agents, they'll work in task force with some of these officers. I think ideally you want to have something totally independent to investigate police shootings across the state that they don't fall under the GBI or any other law enforcement entity, and that has some community control. So I go back to this issue of community control. And then the second question was regarding, what was your second piece?
It's
A way
actually about grand juries.
The grand jury.
Supplant the grand jury.
I
Talk
think,
about direct indict.
yeah,
It's not going to happen.
the issue with the grand jury is it's improved, but it's not what it should be. And the other part of it is that when you look at the grand jury, the way it functions, I actually just so everybody knows, I actually represented an officer before. So y'all, I'm equal-handed here. You're like, what? I'm going to hear about that from some people. But I represented an officer, and Tawana Morgan, who worked with us, we sat in, and it's just like, if you've ever been in a grand jury, it's crazy. It's like the prosecutor just, it's real chummy, and so it baffles me when you can't get an indictment when I see you just, hey, this is why this one should go, and I'm kind of oversimplifying it, but really it's very informal and very relaxed and personal. And to not be able to get an indictment, if we knew what it looked like in there, the whole world would be outraged when you say, I can't get an indictment. What do you mean you can't get an indictment? They say you can indict a ham sandwich, and I know we got some former prosecutors in here, but I mean, it's pretty easy to get an indictment in Georgia. So.
Yeah, it is.
I have the Jerry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just one thing really quick. Atlanta actually has, and it's responsive to the question, Atlanta has a citizen review board, and it's an independent board. It's got staff. They have oftentimes recommended that officers be disciplined, and they write these detailed reports. And in almost every occasion, the chief refuses to accept their recommendation and the legislation doesn't require him to give any explanation of why he disregards a 20-page report from the Citizen Review Board that's researched, that's documented, that's based upon evidence. And he writes a one-page letter where he changes the tune and disregards everything that the Citizen Review Board has done. So a Citizen Review Board can be effective, but its findings have to be respected in some way.
Well, I have the kind of unpleasant task of bringing the conversation to a close, but I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists for a very discussion.